أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك استغيث. So today's live stream is more of a situation where I will be researching and studying in real time, so you can have an idea in terms of how I go about doing things. So today we will be looking at how the environment affects brain development, particularly in children. This is a project I'm working on. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Right now we're going to be looking at an interesting book which is titled From Neurons to Neighborhoods. So let me just bring this up here. Bring this up here. So let's attempt at looking at what Shankov has to say in their book. Here the idea is earliest years of life represent a critical window for brain development, where the architecture of the brain is exquisitely sensitive to the environmental inputs. So it's telling me to look at chapter 8. Right, so let's begin looking at chapter number 8 here. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Developing brain. The brain is the ultimate organ of adaptation. It takes in information and orchestrates complex behavioral repertoires that allow human beings to act in sometimes marvelous, sometimes terrible ways. Most of what people think of as the self, what we think, what we remember, what we can do, how we feel, is acquired by the brain from the experiences that occur after birth. Some of this information is acquired during critical or sensitive periods of development, when the brain appears uniquely ready to take in certain kinds of information, while other information can be acquired across broad swaths of development that can extend into adulthood. So, what is being said? So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Research for 2025 childhood development. So, brain is an adaptive organ there is a remarkable spectrum of ability possibilities which coincide with the rapid development which characterizes the early childhood development period all the way up to the brain's lifelong capacities for growth and change Right, okay. So the balance between the enduring significance of early brain development and its impressive continuing plasticity lies at the heart of the current controversy about the effects of the brain of early experience. Right, interesting. Controversy lies between the balance of enduring significance of early brain development and the continuity of the brain's plasticity and the overall effects on early experience. Right, okay. Hello from Indonesia. Walaikum salam. Falastin Hurrah. Okay, what else is ChatGPT saying? So that's chapter 8 so far. The past 20 years have seen unprecedented progress in understanding how the brain develops, and in particular the phenomenal changes in both its circuitry and neurochemistry that occur during prenatal and early postnatal development. As discussed in chapter 2, knowledge of the ways in which genes and the environment interact to affect the maturation of the brain has expanded by leaps and bounds. I knew it. I was a bit hesitant to add this initially on my essay, but clearly genes and environment interactions right. The years ahead will bring even more breathtaking progress, as, for example, knowledge of the human genome is increasingly transformed into a knowledge about how genes are expressed in the brain. This promises a dramatic expansion in the ability to understand the interweaving of genetic environmental influences as they affect brain and behavioral development. صح. So here's a paper. The authors of this book mention Nelson and Bloom. Childhood development and neuroscience. Why does this sound familiar? No. Okay. Although developmental psychology and developmental neuroscience share interests in common problems, example given the nature of thought, emotion, and consciousness, there has been little cross-fertilization between these disciplines. To facilitate such communication, the authors discuss two major advances in the developmental brain sciences that have potentially profound implications for understanding behavioral development. The first concerns neuroimaging, and the second concerns molecular and cellular events that give rise to the developing brain and the myriad ways in which the brain is modified by both positive and negative life experiences. Okay. Recurring themes are that critical. Recurring themes are that critical. New knowledge of behavioral development can be achieved by considering the neurobiological mechanisms that guide and influence childhood development, and these neurobiological mechanisms are in turn influenced by behavior. Specific topics discussed include neuropsychological tools, metabolic, electrophysiological, and magnetic procedures, molecular biology of brain development, neural and behavioral plasticity, and neuroplasticity in the developing and mature organism. Right, so I need to make notes on this. So what I like to do is when I'm looking to create a piece, in this case an essay, I like to study the core ideas and make notes. And when I find ideas, references, papers of interest, I like to make a separate, smaller note. And this is instructive for me, where I revisit a reference and I go through a step-by-step approach and ensure that at the end of it all, it can be applied, or if it cannot be applied, and then explore a separate avenue. So for example, in this instant, we have Nelson and Bloom's paper, right? and this is developmental neuroscience. And the reason this particular paper is relevant because we are looking at a few things here: genes and environment, right? And we are also looking at neuroimaging, because without neuroimaging it's fruitless doing neuroscientific studies, and also molecular interactions and cellular events. Interactions and cellular events. And then after that, we the neurobiological mechanisms that are being spoken about here. Neurobiological mechanisms. So I've made a note here, and this is from 1997, right? So in my previous, one of my previous podcasts in Islamic neuroscience, talking about neuroconstructivism, I spoke about Michael Ritter's work on gene-environment interaction and gene-environment correlation. So the whole idea is to understand how the environment and the developing child's genes interact, and how the environment and the developing child's genes correlate in terms of changes such as behavior change that is produced. Behavior could be an outcome, or could be an activity, or a sub-activity that leads to an outcome, which may or may not be behavioral. So there's many tenets to this particular area of neuroscience and developmental psychology. It's one of my favorite areas, actually, genes and environment. Right, so I'll attempt to also clip what I've just mentioned. But yeah, that's the key aspect, is that when you are looking to produce a piece, you have to obviously approach it from an intellectual point of view and make it compelling, where the person reads it and understands in lucid language, and it's easy for the other person, even if they're an expert or not, make their life easy. And the method is what I've shown you so far, and the methodology also is the sequential things I'm showing right now. And the procedure also is quite obvious here. Last aspect, which takes time, is the technique. Technique as in the key metrics and the domains and the activities that you can measure and understand. So, okay, I can do this in X amount of time and I can do that in Y amount of time. So it's these variables that we have to, of course, look at. Anyway, in any case, that's done. Now we move forward, right? Growth in brain knowledge naturally leads to question about what it means for raising children and specifically for improving their development. Accordingly, efforts to translate this emerging knowledge for public consumption have proliferated in recent years. Some of this information has been portrayed well and accurately, but some has not. This challenge of deciphering what this information means for what parents, guardians, and teachers of young children should be enormous. There are intellectually few neuroscience studies of very young children, and those that exist have not usually focused on the brain regions that affect cognition, emotions, and other complex developmental tasks. Much of the fundamental knowledge about brain development is based on experimental studies of animals. The translation of this information from basic neuroscience into rules for application to humans can be quite straightforward when the mechanisms involved are very similar in humans and animals, as is the case with the developing visual system. But the interpretation of other data from animals, or even some data from humans, such as estimates of the density of synapses in various brain regions at various ages, can be extraordinarily complex or inappropriate when the brain mechanisms of cognition, language, and social emotional development are addressed. In this context, it is essential to balance excitement about all new learning with caution about the limits of what is understood today. So, in other words, it's not always appropriate and fair to extrapolate findings in animal studies and then apply it to human beings and also to developmental studies in children. I've never read this book before. This is the first time I'm reading this, and subhanAllah, I said the exact same sentiment in my essay, From Crawling to Certainty, in agreement with this book, From Neurons to Neighborhoods. So just because some human activities share similarities with animals doesn't mean you can extrapolate the findings from animals and apply it principally to human beings. And from said studies and findings, you devise theories and laws and methodologies and so on. So it's very cumbersome, very troublesome, very awkward at times. So that's where neuroscience is in terms of one of the biggest limitations. So developmental neuroscience research says a great deal about the conditions that pose dangers to the developing brain and from which young children need to be protected. It says virtually nothing about what to do to create enhanced or accelerated brain development. Right, so developmental neuroscience research says a great deal about the conditions. Right, so developmental neuroscience does not inform us on on what to do to create enhanced or accelerated brain development. Interesting. In Islam, we certainly have many axioms that enhance our brain development and also accelerate brain development, but that is more in the scope of metaphysics rather than psychophysics. So there possibly could be room for developmental neuroscience to push certain aspects of Islamic theology and develop these methods. Interesting area of study. Number 2, the developing brain is open to influential experiences across broad periods of development. This openness to experience is part of what accounts for the remarkable adaptability of the developing mind, although there are a few aspects of brain growth that require particular kinds of experience at particular times. As far as we know at present, this is more the exception than the norm. Although there are a few aspects of brain growth. Okay. Few aspects of brain growth, development, few aspects of brain growth that require particular kinds of experience at particular times. Right, next, the kinds of early experiences on which healthy brain development depends are ubiquitous and typical early human experience, just as nature intended. This means, however, that concern should be devoted to children who, for reasons of visual impairment, auditory processing problems, major perceptual motor delays, and other basic deficits, cannot obtain these experiences on which the developing nervous system depends. Right, so actually need to take note of that. Abusive or neglectful care. Number 4, abusive or neglective care growing up in a dangerous or toxic environment. And related conditions are manifest risks for healthy brain development. Beyond these extremes, the nature and boundaries of the environmental conditions necessary for healthy brain growth are less well known, partly owing to the complexity and the cumulative achievements of cognitive, language, and socio-emotional growth. Exploration in this area is cutting-edge research. Studying the developing brain. Neuroscience techniques have advanced significantly, rendering studies of young children's brains more feasible and informative than in the recent past. These techniques have enabled scientists to learn more about how babies' brains change with developmental and how vulnerable or resilient they are to environmental harm. Hmm. However, the repertoire of techniques that can be used with preschool age and even younger children is still limited. Some of the more direct methods, i.e. looking into the brain, are either invasive, positron emission tomography requires the injection of a radioactive substance, or require long periods of remaining still, for example, functional magnetic resonance imaging. Nevertheless, by tracking the brain's activity from the outside with the electroencephalogram, event-related potentials, and magnetic encephalography, researchers can learn about brain functioning in very young children. For instance, scientists can record the electrical or magnetic activity of the brain while the child is presented with different stimuli, example given, speech and sounds, identify which parts of the brain are active and how active they are when children are doing different things. This approach has been used to reveal that the neural substrate for recognizing faces and facial expressions is remarkably similar in infants and adults. So here's an interesting study, slowly shutting down. Recognition of the mother's face by 6-month-old infants, a neurobehavioral study. Event-related potentials were recorded from 6 months as each S watched pictures of their mother's face and a stranger face. The ERPs differ for the two faces, but the pattern of neural activity elicited depended on whether the mother and stranger looked different. Experiment 1, 22 or alike. 22. In contrast, when different 6-month-olds were shown one of these 44 pairs of faces, the ERPs do not differ between two faces. In a visual preference test of recognition, infants showed no evidence of recognizing the mother's face. Together, these results suggest that infants are able to recognize their mother's face as pattern number 1. The neural processes accompanying recognition depend on the difficulty with which mother can be discriminated from a stranger, and 2. Under the conditions investigated in the study, ERPs are a more sensitive measure of recognition than is looking time. Thank you, Brother Javed, for the recommendation. I think you'd be interested in. Thank you very much. Right, so we have here recognition of the mother's face by 6-month-old infants. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because according studies using or utilizing studies utilizing electrical or magnetic activity of a child's brain. So, meaning that while a child is presented with different stimuli, example given here is speech sounds, but you can also say faces. Speech sounds / faces. Parts of the brain are identified that are active and how active they are when children are doing different things, are doing different things. And the study mentioned, one of them mentioned, is Dehan and Nelson 97, which is quite interesting, well, fascinating. 6-month-old infants can recognize their mother's faces. SubhanAllah. Okay, so this is interesting where ERP will record as each stimulus. Let me read the abstract because this doesn't make sense. What's S? كده. It's not coming up. It's really annoying. Fine. Right, so event-related potentials, ERP, methods were employed. Classic and stimulus shown. Similar / alike and different. And different stimulus shown. And what was the fifth study they were looking at? In a visual preference test. Visual preference test. And recognition of recognition right, okay. And this is by Dehan. I'm stuck on this for awful amounts of time. Okay. Dehan and Nelson. ठीक है जी 1997 बहुत पुरानी बात है. I can't believe I'm talking to a 5th grader on here, bruv. Inshallah, the aim is to tutor you free of cost. It's important that we protect our future generations being plagued by all the heathens that exist out there. Anyway, so going back to from neurons to neighborhoods, I really like that title. So let's look at 1999. Brain differentiates face and object processing in 6-month-old infants. Wow, okay. Fascinating. The US Department of Education government website also has uploaded this paper. Right, so in this other study, event-related potentials were used to determine whether infants, like adults, show differences in spatial and temporal characteristics of brain activation during face and object recognition. 3 aspects of visual processing were identified. A. Differentiation of face versus object. P400 occipitable electrode was shorter latency for faces. It's a shorter time frame for processing faces. B. Recognition of familiar identity. NC or negative component of frontotemporal electrodes, and the transverse wave like data amplitude was larger. C. Encoding novelty. Slow wave at FTEs was larger for unfamiliar stimuli. So they saw that encoding of new things, i.e. unfamiliar stimuli, showed a slower wave. The topography of the NC was influenced by category type. So effects of familiarity were limited to the midline and right anterior temporal electrodes for faces, but extended to all temporal electrodes for objects. Results show that infants experience with specific examples within categories and their general category knowledge influence the neural correlates of visual processing. So the results show that infants experience with specific examples within categories, okay, and the general category knowledge influence the neural correlates. So the experience of specific examples of an object face within categories, furniture for example, garden, and their general category, so house for example, urban environment. So general category knowledge influence the neural correlates of visual processing. Interesting. Okay. Right, so this is the end of today's stream. Inshallah, we'll be back most likely tomorrow, although I like to do a Quran stream, but I have some tajweed and grammar things to do. But yeah, this essay is gonna be a fun one, inshallah. Till next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.